Jackie Small is what we call a pioneer. She's been pioneering in the world of psychotherapy for years. She started out in the addiction world and really helped that world change an idea of addiction being just a problem to addiction being a call to find one's soul, healing from that being a path of the soul. And she's doing that now in the general field of psychotherapy, adding a soulfulness to our search.
I believe that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. I don't believe we're human beings trying to find a way to be spiritual. And when you turn that around and look at it that way, what you see is everything about your life begins to change. The way that you perceive reality begins to change. The way you perceive the mistakes that you make, you see that these are soul lessons. The soul has come here to learn how to be human, and this is what soul-based psychology teaches us. It teaches us the principles of how to be human while remembering that we are a spiritual being. Psychology is having to expand because human beings are. And it really got to the point in about the mid-70s that clients were outreaching their own therapists because they were having mystical experiences. They were having direct contact with the God of their understanding, beginning to study with spiritual teachers, believing they had spirit guides. And I was one of the people back in those days that realized that we needed a psychology that defines the self bigger than just an ego needing to be fixed. And interestingly, paradoxically, the name psychology means the study of the soul, because the word psyche in Greek means soul. So that what we have to realize is the human psyche is our incarnated soul. And it's so strange that we don't realize this consciously. I asked my husband one day, why do you think we don't realize that psyche is our soul? And he said, because we are her. And if you think about it, it's like we're standing in the middle of our own picture and we don't really know who we are. So when you define the self as having both an ego and a soul, you realize that our nature is both human and divine. In other words, we're a hybrid creature. And psyche is the link between spirit and the material self, or the physical self. So I've become fascinated with psyche and named my work Soul-Based Psychology when my new book came out, which tells about the goddess Psyche's journey through life. Because if you remember, Psyche is the mythical goddess who fell to earth and took on the human condition and became a human girl. And frankly, I believe that's what we've all done, you see. And when you define yourself that way and you begin to live life that way, then the mistakes that you make are much more excusable, meaning that you don't go into judgment and shame and blame. You honor the mistakes you make as lessons. You own them, you acknowledge them, you correct them, and you go on about your life in a way that's much healthier than when you think you're this ego who gets sick all the time and has to run to some expert to get fixed. The old Newtonian Cartesian model of physics doesn't work anymore. We're not like clocks that can be fixed by an expert. We are participating in the evolutionary consciousness. We are evolutionary creatures, and the soul has come to planet Earth to take on the human body so it can walk around here in some sort of a vehicle that can live here. And we are actually spiritualizing matter by taking on this condition and going through it from beginning to end. And in my new book, I start out by talking about the soul and giving people a lot of information about it, because as I say, the soul is psyche. And the psyche is not just who we take to a shrink when we feel troubled. And in fact, in my new book, I give 12 seed thoughts. And let me explain a seed thought very quickly. A seed thought is not a typical thought. It's a thought that gets planted in your mind that's based in universal truth. And you may not even recognize it at the time as being something very valuable to you, but it goes in the mind and it digs down and takes root. And then it begins to blossom, just like a seed will do. And then you begin to live out of that thought. And especially at times in life when you need it. It'll come to you to remember that particular thought, and it will carry you through a time in your life to keep you evolving and to keep you on your path. So soul-based psychology tells you that you have a mission and a purpose here. Everyone does. And that our main purpose is to grow fully into our blossomed self. And think what the world would be like if every one of us walked around as our completed, whole self. That is a spiritual being living in a human body. We would have no more wars. We would have no more competition. There would be a right relationship. We would all be valuing one another and valuing ourselves. And we would all remember that we're here to serve what we consider to be our source of inspiration. Some people call that God. Some call it cosmic consciousness. The superior whatever that rules all of the universe. And that sounds lofty. But interestingly, the seed thoughts that go with remembering that you're a soul in a physical body are really the most practical kind of wisdom that you could ever imagine. The first one being always to remember that you're both human and divine. Trying to be just one or the other does not gratify the self. Because the self is, as I said earlier, is the soul living in a physical body. So if I'm just gratifying my ego all the time, my soul gets sick. If I'm trying to just gratify my soul all the time, my ego doesn't have a chance to experience being human. And the first sentence in this book says, I'm writing this book to tell people about the sacred purpose of being human. Because what I have found is an awful lot of people are trying to be spiritual these days. And they try to do it by being out of body or by putting down the human nature as though it's wrong or evil, or some churches even call it sinful. And I would like for people to know that being human and becoming fully human is the most spiritual we can ever be. So in soul-based psychology, the first principle being that we're both human and divine, there's another one that has to follow right alongside it, to remind ourselves that the self or the soul is greater than our conditions. Because people get caught up in their conditions in life, and we start judging ourselves and giving ourselves all these labels, like I am a neurotic, I am the child of an alcoholic, I am a depressive, and we're none of those things. Those are conditions that the soul goes through while it's learning how to be human. But we're the soul, we're the self, and the self can always rise up and out of any condition and can see the bigger picture. And from this point of view up here, is able to look down and see how to heal or how to resolve whatever issue it's caught up in, or sometimes just how to grieve it and own it and go through it. The third seed thought is whatever you say I am to has a way of claiming you. Now, this is a matter of identity. We have to realize that thought is creative. And if I'm walking around telling myself I am a failure, the universe is going to bring me experiences that cause me to fail. If I tell myself I am a victim, the universe will bring me perpetrators so that I can say, see, I told you I'm right. See, I am a victim. If I say that I am a daughter of God, traveling through life, learning to become fully blossomed as my spiritual self here in this form, that is a very high story. The fourth principle, or the fourth seed thought, says the human shadow has a sacred purpose. It is not evil, the way many people have been taught to believe. I don't know about you, but I've never met a human being who does not have a dark side. Even gurus. Everybody has a side that sometimes gets angry, gets annoyed, gets gossipy, loses self-esteem, feels pity pot, whatever. Parts of ourselves that we really don't like, that we actually deplore. That's the human shadow. Now, Dr. Carl Jung has done so much work for us to help us understand the human shadow as being our unconscious self. It's not a bad self. It's just the part of us that's not awakened yet, simply because we've not paid any attention to it, because we've been so busy repressing it and pushing it away and playing like we're not it, only seeing it in other people and not seeing it in ourselves. When you begin to own your shadow, and that's really just simply being honest with yourself, owning that I am someone who sometimes has temper fits. I sometimes get into seductiveness or manipulation or whatever it is that you feel is your weak side or your dark side. The interesting thing is the shadow comes out of the unconscious. If you make your shadow conscious, it walks along beside you in life. It's still the shadow. It still has shadow nature, just like a scorpion has scorpion nature. You got to be sure and honor it for having shadow nature. But if it feels accepted by you, that you have taken it into the psyche and owned it as a part of yourself rather than going, that's not me, then the funny thing about it is it quits acting out so much. You still might get angry, you still might get gossipy or jealous or whatever, but you'll recognize it before you act on it. You'll see yourself doing it, or you'll hear yourself doing it, and you'll pull back and maybe make amends or apologize. And I tell you, it makes your life unfold in a much more gracious way. The next seed thought says that victimhood is a false concept that makes us powerless. It's much, much better to realize that as a soul traveling through a lifetime of experiences, we are going to be victimized sometimes. We're going to walk into situations where we're betrayed or where someone abuses us. But what we must do is honor that as a teaching for that person and a teaching for me. To know what to avoid, to know how to take care of myself better, to know how to stay in my own power. When people stay in their own power, they're rarely victimized. It's only when we get weak and codependent and start giving our power over to another person that we can become abused. The next seed thought that helps us balance our emotional body is about the human desire nature. A lot of psychologists and even more so religious people try to teach us that desire is bad. And even some of the Eastern religions tend to speak of desire as being something we're supposed to kill off. But I think that that's a misconception. Now, if I'm strongly drawn to something, let's give an example of something not good for me. Let's say drinking too much alcohol, perhaps. Someone could say, how could that be God's love operating in your life? Well, if I'm drawn to it that much that I feel the compulsion to do it all the time, it's something in me that needs to be healed. And I believe the higher power will guide us to that very thing to give us the lesson that it won't work. Because if it's in us as a compulsion and we're constantly desiring it and we don't test it out or work with it consciously, it doesn't mean we have to act on it, but we need to work with it consciously, then we never understand that part of ourselves. And so we never grow past it. It just remains as a compulsion inside the unconscious mind. The desire nature is God's love operating in our life, but we have to take responsibility for what it is that we desire and learn to understand it at its very, very depths. Because even the example I gave about the alcoholic, it's never really alcohol the person's craving. It's the experience they think the alcohol gives them. And so when you get underneath the craving for alcohol and see what the desire really is, it's really a true desire to be loved, to belong, to feel more secure with yourself, to feel like you're more important or whatever. And those are natural ego desires that we all need to meet in some way or another. The seventh seed thought is a very complex one, and it requires a lot of contemplation. It's about the fact that we have to learn to live within the tension of the opposites within us, as though we walk in both worlds. We've got a dark side, a light side. We have got all kinds of opposites that live within us. In fact, every quality we have has its opposite. For instance, my successful self has a fear of failure. My beautiful self worries about being ugly. My supportive self can sometimes be judgmental and harsh. You just go on and on with that. Now, the way that you heal these negative sides of yourself, or the negative sides of life, learn to live with the negative sides of life, is not to avoid the dark side, but to own both aspects of the self. I've got a part of myself that's very balanced and centered. I have a part of myself that's very passionate and strong and just comes out with my feelings. Now, if I bring those two together in the middle, I have a passionate, centered self. You see? The shadow has something positive to give us if we can call out the beauty of it. And because the shadow is always passionate. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to live without passion. The next seed thought is one I've already alluded to earlier, that when you're on a path of self-knowledge or a path of awakening, there can be no outer experts, because the self is the teacher, and the self lives within you. And that's one of the things that, one of the reasons soul-based psychology is coming in so strongly now, because we're in a paradigm shift where we're moving from outer experts telling us how to live our life, which is how the old psychology does it, to learning how to discover the wisdom and the genius within ourselves. And the therapists of the future, the therapists that are soul-based, draw that out in their clients. They don't allow the clients to become dependent on them as the expert. They listen to their clients and bring out the part of them that is so wise. Even if you're talking to someone who doesn't even believe they have a wise self, you can say to someone, well, what would your wise self say about that? And they'll say, well, I don't have a wise self. This is just me sitting here. And then you can say, but what if you just imagine for a minute that you have a wise self? What would that wise self say? And then you should hear the beauty that comes out of people, even people who don't know yet that they have a wise self. The next seed thought I want to tell you about is one that I think most people realize already, and that is that an open heart is the bridge into the divine. People with closed hearts live in the lower three chakras. They're interested in security, safety, how to belong, how to have a good sex life, how to have some sort of ego identity that makes them feel good about themselves, that makes them feel important. When the heart opens, which is the fourth chakra, levels 5, 6, and 7 pour in, which is higher mind, compassion, and the will of God that pours straight through the self, where some people feel like they're channeling or having revelations or feeling that they're open to the divine or even an expression of the divine. The human soul gets distressed when it's bursting into a new form. When some new aspect of you is trying to be born, we go through the pangs of birth, which are very, very hurtful. I mean, it's like the snake shedding a skin. We outgrow ourselves, and we have to burst the boundary of how we've thought, how we've emoted, how we've walked through life. The old paradigm psychology labels us through DSM codes that can apply for insurance when we're having distress in our lives. We are given a psychological or a psychiatric label, and then quite often we're given medication to heal it. That's the old way of doing it. Right now I'm very distressed that so many of our children are being put on Ritalin because they're so full of creativity and they're so busy acting out all the time because they're bored to death in school, and the parents and the teachers don't know how to control them, so they're being given drugs. Then later they become drug addicts and get blamed for it, which is very sad to me. The same thing happens with the grown-ups. We're given medications based on the labels that we're given whenever we have distress. But you see, that's just the wrong way to look at it. It's very disconcerting, and that's why we have a national healing program and a training program to help take people through these times of transition, when people hit those transitory periods in their life where it's just a temporary time where they're passing from an old way of being into a new way of being. We help them go through the pangs of birth and to recognize that they don't have to label themselves all these sickness labels. We're going to stop pathologizing the self in the future, and we're going to help people birth into their future a lot more gracefully. In order for us to grow as evolutionary creatures here in the world, we're always going to have to die to the old in order to get born to the new. And every time we hit one of those death-rebirth sequences, we have to sacrifice something. But it'll be a limited way that we have been living, as opposed to what's coming. But quite often, we're having to sacrifice the old before we know what the new is. We have a phrase we call hanging in the dangle, where your old way has died, but your new way hasn't quite gotten born yet. But what I've learned about it is if you're willing to go with the Lords of Sacrifice and just give up what it is that's not working anymore, let go of it, drop it, let it go, and be willing to live in the dangle with the faith that what's going to come next is going to be better. I guarantee you, what comes next is better. It always is. The 12 seed thought says that as you cultivate your own nature, all around you begins to grow. I can also say all around you begin to grow because the people in your life even begin to grow. It's just awesome. And the key to this principle, I think the spiritual truth behind it, is that we can only work on ourselves. We cannot fix another person, and we cannot make another person change. But if I'm willing to work on myself and come more and more into my full expression as Jacquelyn, a spiritual being in human form, I'm going to have more compassion, I'm going to have more patience, I'm going to have more love in my heart, because I'm going to be living out of the qualities of the soul. And as I do that, it just causes everything around me to start flourishing. People don't want to pick fights with me because I'm not competitive. I'm honoring everyone else. I own my shadow, and so I'm not so mad at you when you're caught in yours. I have compassion for you if you're caught in your shadow. So all of these things are what lead us to a much healthier life that's more grace-filled. And I would just like to tell everyone, work on yourself, do inner work, and watch for the magic that starts occurring in your life.